The world did not announce its ending. It continued to wake each morning under familiar skies, governed by rituals that had endured for generations, ruled by institutions that still spoke with confidence and authority. Markets opened, flags were raised, orders were issued and obeyed. To those living within it, this age felt permanent, reinforced by habit and memory. Yet beneath the appearance of continuity, pressures were building. Borders strained, economies bent, and ideas once dismissed as marginal began to circulate with unsettling persistence. History, as it so often does, was already moving, even while most believed they were standing still. Empires at their height rarely recognized their decline. The structures that once guaranteed stability often conceal their own weaknesses, absorbing strain until they no longer can. Administrative systems grew heavier, decision-making slower, loyalty conditional rather than instinctive. Military traditions that had once delivered victory relied on assumptions no longer shared by the world beyond their borders. Rivals adapted, technologies shifted, and populations changed faster than inherited systems could respond. The outward symbols of power remained intact, but their foundations had begun to erode, quietly and unevenly, across regions and generations. For centuries, authority had flowed along predictable paths. Rank, lineage, and ritual defined who commanded and who followed. Warfare followed understood patterns, bound by codes that shaped not only combat but identity itself. To serve was to belong, and to belong was to know one's place within an order that promised meaning. These values were not abstractions. They governed daily life, shaping posture, language, and expectation. Yet as political realities shifted, those same values became increasingly misaligned with emerging forms of power that rewarded speed, flexibility, and scale over tradition. Change did not arrive evenly. In some regions, it appeared as distant news, carried by merchants or soldiers returning from unfamiliar fronts. In others, it arrived through subtle administrative reforms, new taxes, or unfamiliar uniforms enforcing old laws in new ways. The distance between policy and consequence grew shorter. Decisions made far from the periphery now produced immediate effects on lives that had once existed at the margins of imperial attention. The sense of separation that had protected local worlds from distant politics began to dissolve. Military institutions felt this strain early. Drills repeated movements perfected for battles that no longer occurred. Weapons designed for earlier conflicts remained symbols of honor even as they lost effectiveness. Officers trained in established doctrines struggled to interpret wars that no longer respected those rules. The clash was not merely tactical but philosophical. Courage, once measured through proximity and endurance, now faced weapons that rendered such measures irrelevant. Discipline remained, but its purpose grew uncertain as outcomes depended increasingly on factors beyond individual control. Social hierarchies, too, began to falter. The promises that had bound populations to rulers weakened as opportunities narrowed and expectations shifted. Younger generations inherited titles, lands, and obligations whose value diminished with each passing decade. Loyalty became transactional rather than absolute. In places where identity had once been anchored to service, people quietly recalibrated their futures, seeking stability outside systems that no longer guaranteed it. The old language of honor persisted, but it spoke less convincingly to those confronting new realities. Yet decline rarely feels dramatic from within. There were no universal alarms, no shared acknowledgement that an age was ending. Instead, there was adjustment, compromise, temporary measures that became permanent through repetition. Leaders assured their subjects that reforms would restore balance, that disruptions were manageable, that continuity would prevail. Many believed them because belief itself was a stabilizing force. To question permanence was to invite uncertainty, and uncertainty threatened everything built upon inherited order. Across this landscape of quiet erosion, lives continued to unfold. Children were born into households shaped by traditions that still structured daily existence, even as those traditions lost relevance beyond their immediate context. Skills were taught, expectations passed down, futures imagined according to rules that had governed generations before. Few could see how rapidly those rules were narrowing, how the world awaiting these children would differ from the one their elders described. History's momentum was already set, but its direction remained obscured by familiarity. This was the moment before recognition, the interval between stability and collapse where contradiction thrives. Systems still functioned, yet no longer coherently. Authority remained visible, yet increasingly contested. The past retained its grip, even as the future pressed closer with each decision delayed or avoided. It is within such moments that individuals are formed, shaped by values already slipping out of alignment with reality. They are prepared for worlds that will not exist when they are called to act. The end of an age does not arrive with clarity. It emerges through accumulation, through countless ordinary choices made under extraordinary pressure. By the time collapse becomes undeniable, its origins are already distant. This chapter belongs to that earlier time, when endings were still invisible and continuity felt assured. It is here, in the quiet weakening of once unquestioned systems, that the conditions for what follows were set, long before anyone understood what was being lost. He entered the world without ceremony, in a place where births were measured not by dates but by seasons and memory. The year mattered less than the rhythm of life into which he arrived, a rhythm governed by labor, obligation, and continuity. His family belonged to a community that understood itself through repetition. The same fields were worked, the same paths walked, the same stories told at the end of long days. Nothing in his arrival suggested interruption. He was another child born into a lineage that expected endurance rather than distinction, contribution rather than transformation. His earliest surroundings were shaped by limits that felt natural rather than imposed. Geography defined movement, climate dictated work, and hierarchy structured relationships. Authority was visible and close, embodied by elders, officers, and figures whose power came not from abstraction but from presence. These were people he could see, hear, and imitate. They spoke with certainty about how the world functioned and what was required to survive within it. Their confidence rested on experience drawn from a past that still seemed intact. From a young age, he absorbed expectations without instruction. Work came before reflection, obedience before choice. The skills he learned were practical, repetitive, and deeply physical. Strength was valued, but so was restraint. Endurance mattered more than speed, reliability more than innovation. These values were not framed as virtues. They were necessities proven over time. To live otherwise was to invite instability, something his world had little tolerance for. In this environment, the idea of change carried risk rather than promise. Family life reinforced this stability. Roles were clear and rarely questioned. Men labored and prepared for defense, women sustained households and continuity, elders mediated memory and meaning. The warrior's childhood unfolded within this structure, shaped by observation rather than instruction. He learned when to speak by listening, when to act by watching. Approval was quiet, disapproval unmistakable. Identity formed through participation, not assertion. There was comfort in knowing what was expected and satisfaction in meeting those expectations. Training for conflict came gradually, almost incidentally. Physical tasks hardened the body long before weapons were introduced. Games mirrored future responsibilities, turning preparation into routine rather than spectacle. When instruction did arrive, it emphasized discipline over aggression. Violence was treated as a tool, not an expression. The warrior learned to move with others, to respond to commands, to trust systems older than himself. These lessons were reinforced by stories of past struggles, told not to inspire glory but to emphasize survival. Nothing distinguished him from his peers. He was neither the strongest nor the weakest, neither especially gifted nor notably flawed. His value lay in reliability. He showed up, completed tasks, and accepted correction. This normality was essential. It meant that when larger forces later shaped his path, he would not be driven by exceptional ambition or resentment. He was representative, shaped by common pressures rather than personal deviation. History would use him not because he sought it, but because he was available to it. The world around him appeared stable enough to justify these assumptions. Authority still functioned, traditions still held, and the boundaries of life seemed defined. Older generations spoke of hardship, but always within a framework that implied resolution. Struggle was temporary, endurance rewarded. The future, while uncertain in detail, appeared structurally familiar. There was little sense that the foundations themselves were weakening. The warrior inherited confidence in continuity without ever consciously choosing it. As he grew, subtle inconsistencies appeared, though they were easy to ignore. Stories of distant conflicts sounded different from those of the past. Returning men spoke of unfamiliar tactics, larger forces, outcomes decided beyond individual effort. Yet these accounts remained abstract, filtered through distance and authority. Daily life continued unchanged. Training followed established forms. Orders still came from familiar sources. The gap between inherited preparation and emerging reality widened quietly, without immediate consequence. Psychologically, the warrior developed an internal economy based on restraint. Fear was managed through repetition, ambition moderated by duty. He learned to endure discomfort without complaint and uncertainty without panic. These traits served him well within his environment, reinforcing trust from superiors and peers alike. They also limited his capacity to question the direction of events beyond his immediate control. He did not imagine alternatives. He adapted within given constraints. What defined his early life was not promise but alignment. His skills matched expectations, his values matched structure, his identity matched environment. This alignment created a sense of belonging that would later become a source of tension. When systems began to shift, those most aligned with the old order often felt the greatest dislocation. At this stage, however, there was no awareness of impending rupture. The warrior's life progressed as intended, steady and unremarkable. The tragedy of his story lies partly in this ordinariness. He was not preparing to challenge history, only to participate in it as generations before him had done. The tools he acquired, both physical and psychological, were suited to a world nearing its end. By the time he would be called upon to act, the assumptions that shaped him would no longer hold. Yet nothing in his early life suggested this outcome. He stood ready for a future that was already receding, shaped not by choice, but by timing. The traditions that shaped him were not improvised responses to danger but accumulated solutions to survival, refined over generations. They governed how men stood, spoke, fought, and obeyed. These customs were reinforced through repetition rather than explanation, embedded so deeply that they felt instinctive. To serve within this system was not experienced as submission but as participation in something older and larger than any individual life. The warrior's identity took form inside this framework, shaped by rules that promised order in a world assumed to be stable. Loyalty stood at the center of this structure. It was not emotional attachment but a practical bond, linking individual survival to collective discipline. Orders were followed not because they were always understood, but because obedience ensured coherence. Disobedience threatened not only authority but the fragile balance that kept communities intact. The warrior learned early that hesitation could endanger others, and certainty, even when flawed, was preferable to doubt. This ethic fostered trust in hierarchy, a belief that those above had perspective denied to those below. Combat traditions reflected the same logic. Fighting was not glorified as violence for its own sake but respected as a controlled extension of duty. Training emphasized formation, timing, and mutual reliance. Individual bravery mattered only insofar as it supported collective effectiveness. Recklessness was discouraged, not admired. The warrior learned to conserve energy, to move deliberately, to endure discomfort without complaint. These skills were measured, practiced, and evaluated against standards inherited from earlier conflicts that had validated their effectiveness. Hierarchy structured every interaction. Rank determined responsibility, not worth. Superiors were expected to command decisively, subordinates to execute reliably. This clarity reduced friction, allowing large groups to act as a single organism. Within this system, personal identity was inseparable from role. To know who one was meant understanding where one stood. Advancement followed demonstrated competence and loyalty, reinforcing belief in the system's fairness. The warrior's sense of self grew from fulfilling expectations rather than redefining them. Cultural rituals reinforced these values outside moments of conflict. Ceremonies marked transitions, reinforcing continuity between generations. Stories of past campaigns were told with restraint, focusing on endurance and sacrifice rather than triumph. Failure was acknowledged quietly, folded into lessons rather than spectacle. These narratives taught the warrior that history was not a sequence of heroic moments but a record of persistence. Honor derived from consistency, not exceptionalism. The material culture surrounding him supported this worldview. Equip Me was designed for durability, not innovation. Weapons were maintained meticulously, their familiarity valued as much as their function. Uniforms signaled belonging, reducing individuality in favor of cohesion. Even posture and movement were regulated, aligning bodies to shared purpose. These details mattered because they reduced uncertainty. In environments where survival depended on predictability, tradition became a form of protection. Social expectations mirrored military ones. Personal ambition was tempered by obligation to family and community. Success was measured by reliability rather than recognition. Those who deviated too sharply from norms risked isolation. This discouraged experimentation but strengthened resilience. The warrior internalized these limits, learning to measure desire against responsibility. Restraint became a virtue, a way of navigating complexity without destabilizing the system that sustained him. Crucially, these traditions were coherent. They addressed real needs in the context in which they developed. They had produced stability, defended territory, and preserved identity through earlier periods of uncertainty. To dismiss them as obsolete would be to ignore their historical effectiveness. The warrior did not cling to them out of ignorance, but out of lived experience that validated their logic. His respect for these systems was earned, not inherited blindly. Yet the very completeness of this training concealed its vulnerability. It prepared him flawlessly for conflicts defined by proximity, limited scale, and recognizable authority. It assumed that wars would be decided by discipline and endurance, that loyalty would be reciprocated by structure. It did not account for conflicts where distance replaced contact, where scale overwhelmed coordination, where decisions made far away rendered local discipline irrelevant. These gaps were not immediately apparent, because the system still functioned internally even as external conditions changed. Abandoning such traditions was not simply a matter of adaptation. It required dismantling identity. To question the code was to question the self formed within it. For the warrior, this was not an abstract dilemma. His confidence, relationships, and sense of purpose were anchored in these structures. Change threatened coherence, not just effectiveness. This explains why such systems persist even as their utility declines. They endure because they offer meaning, and meaning is harder to replace than strategy. The chapter of history that raised him valued continuity over flexibility. It rewarded those who fit, not those who questioned. This was not a moral failure but a reflection of conditions under which it evolved. The warrior embodied its strengths and limitations equally. His training did not fail him within its original context. History moved beyond that context without waiting for those shaped by it to adjust. Understanding these traditions is essential to understanding the man. He was not stubborn nor unaware. He was disciplined, loyal, and prepared according to standards that had once defined success. The tragedy is not that he held onto a fading world, but that he was shaped so well for it. As the age that formed him began to dissolve, these traditions remained deeply rooted, resisting abandonment because they had once made survival possible. Change first appeared as inconvenience rather than threat. It arrived through altered schedules, revised orders, and unfamiliar equipment that did not quite fit existing routines. Nothing broke outright. No authority collapsed. The systems the warrior depended on continued to function, but with increasing friction. Tasks that once flowed smoothly now required adjustment. Instructions arrived later than expected, or contradicted earlier guidance. These irregularities were easy to explain away. Temporary shortages, administrative reshuffling, isolated political decisions. Such explanations preserved confidence and allowed daily life to continue without alarm. Political shifts were discussed cautiously, often framed as distant matters beyond the concern of ordinary service. Decisions made at higher levels filtered downward in diluted form, stripped of urgency. New priorities emerged, but they were layered atop existing ones rather than replacing them. The result was accumulation rather than clarity. The warrior learned to accommodate overlapping demands, trusting that coherence would eventually be restored. He had been trained to adapt within structure, not to question its direction. Technological changes introduced a different kind of disruption. New tools promised efficiency but required unfamiliar handling. They altered established rhythms of movement and coordination. Training incorporated these additions unevenly, constrained by limited resources and incomplete understanding. The warrior noticed that older techniques were still emphasized, even when their effectiveness diminished. This coexistence of old and new created confusion without confrontation. Nothing explicitly failed, but confidence began to erode at the margins. External pressures intensified gradually. Rivals acted in ways that defied expectation, refusing to engage according to established norms. Conflicts unfolded at scales that strained logistics and command. Reports from other regions described outcomes difficult to reconcile with inherited doctrine. Yet these accounts were filtered through layers of interpretation, softened to fit existing frameworks. The warrior absorbed them as anomalies rather than indicators. History often advances through such misreadings, where evidence accumulates but meaning lags behind. Within his own experience, contradictions emerged quietly. Orders emphasized speed over formation, flexibility over discipline, but without discarding the language of tradition. The warrior complied, adjusting his actions while maintaining outward loyalty. He sensed inconsistency but lacked context to name it. His training encouraged obedience in uncertainty, reinforcing the belief that resolution lay ahead. Doubt was treated as personal weakness rather than systemic signal. Institutional responses favored compromise. Instead of reevaluating foundational assumptions, leaders modified procedures incrementally. This preserved authority while postponing reckoning. The warrior witnessed these adjustments firsthand, participating in drills that blended incompatible approaches. He learned to execute conflicting instructions without commentary, trusting that coherence was someone else's responsibility. This restraint, once a strength, now limited his capacity to recognize the depth of change underway. Social attitudes mirrored this hesitation. Conversations acknowledged strain but resisted interpretation. Complaints focused on logistics rather than direction. Nostalgia surfaced in subtle ways, through comparison with earlier periods remembered as simpler or more effective. These recollections reinforced attachment to familiar systems, framing present difficulties as deviations rather than transformations. The warrior shared these sentiments without fully articulating them, sensing loss without identifying cause. Physically, the environment reflected this uncertainty. Infrastructure aged without replacement. Supply routes grew unreliable. Equipment required improvisation to remain functional. These conditions demanded adaptability, which the warrior possessed, but also revealed limits of endurance-based resilience. Strain accumulated slowly, manifesting as fatigue rather than crisis. The body absorbed pressure much like the system did, compensating until it could no longer do so invisibly. Psychologically, the warrior remained committed. Loyalty was not blind but habitual, reinforced by years of alignment between values and structure. He interpreted contradictions as challenges to be endured, not signs of systemic failure. His identity was bound to service, making withdrawal unthinkable. To question direction would require questioning purpose, a step his environment neither encouraged nor supported. The absence of confrontation was itself telling. No single moment forced recognition. Decline unfolded through normalization of exception. What once would have prompted inquiry became routine. Temporary measures extended indefinitely. The warrior adapted repeatedly, each adjustment small enough to seem reasonable. This gradualism prevented clarity. By the time patterns emerged, they felt inevitable rather than avoidable. History often advances through such quiet erosion. Systems persist not because they remain effective, but because alternatives are unimagined or inaccessible. The warrior lived within this space, loyal to structures that still commanded obedience even as they lost coherence. His experience illustrates how collapse begins not with defiance, but with accommodation. Each compromise preserved function while reducing integrity. Despite these shifts, the warrior did not resist. Resistance requires recognition, and recognition requires perspective denied to those embedded within change. He continued to perform his duties with diligence, adjusting tactics without altering belief. His loyalty was not misplaced within his understanding. It was simply overtaken by events beyond his control. This chapter marks the beginning of divergence between preparation and reality. The warrior's training still guided his actions, but its alignment with outcomes weakened. The world he was prepared for had not yet vanished, but it no longer governed events fully. The ground beneath him shifted incrementally, unnoticed until stability could no longer be assumed. Decline, unannounced and unacknowledged, had begun its work. The first encounters did not resemble the conflicts he had prepared for. They lacked the familiar markers that once framed violence with meaning and order. There were no clear lines where forces assembled with mutual recognition, no shared understanding of how engagement would unfold. Authority felt distant, fragmented across layers that rarely aligned in real time. Orders arrived shaped by assumptions already outdated by the moment they were received. The warrior moved forward nonetheless, relying on training that had once translated uncertainty into action. The scale of violence altered perception immediately. Where earlier conflicts had been measured by proximity and endurance, this war expanded outward, consuming space and time beyond individual awareness. Destruction arrived from distances that rendered courage abstract. Sounds carried differently, heavier and less directional, leaving the body braced without knowing where strain would come from. The warrior learned to advance through noise that no longer corresponded to visible threat. His senses, sharpened by years of preparation, struggled to locate meaning in the chaos. Discipline remained intact, but its effects changed. Formation no longer guaranteed protection. Precision did not ensure survival. The warrior executed movements with practiced efficiency, yet outcomes felt disconnected from effort. Success or failure seemed determined by forces beyond personal influence. This inversion unsettled him more than danger itself. He had been taught that skill translated into control, that mastery reduced uncertainty. Now, mastery persisted without authority over result. Authority itself became abstract. Commanders were present in name but distant in experience, constrained by incomplete information and rapid developments. Decisions reflected necessity rather than intention. The warrior obeyed without hesitation, but sensed the widening gap between instruction and reality. Responsibility flowed downward while understanding did not. This imbalance strained the trust that once anchored loyalty. Still, obedience continued, sustained by habit and belief rather than confidence. The environment reinforced this dislocation. Landscapes were altered by scale, scarred beyond recognition. Familiar terrain offered no advantage when reshaped by new forms of violence. Shelter was temporary, exposure constant. Movement required caution without predictability. The warrior's body absorbed fatigue differently, not through sustained exertion but through prolonged alertness. Sleep came unevenly, interrupted by sounds that no longer signaled specific threats but demanded readiness regardless. Psychologically, the struggle centered on relevance. Fear was present but manageable, regulated by training. What unsettled him was the sense that his presence mattered less than the machinery surrounding him. He fought alongside others who shared his discipline, yet their collective effort felt insufficient against impersonal forces shaping outcomes. The warrior's identity, built around contribution, began to feel misaligned with effect. He was still acting correctly, but correctness no longer ensured significance. Bravery persisted, but it changed character. Acts once considered decisive now registered as symbolic rather than strategic. Courage became endurance without expectation of influence. The warrior adapted by narrowing focus, concentrating on immediate tasks rather than broader purpose. This psychological contraction preserved functionality while limiting reflection. He did not articulate loss of relevance. He compensated for it through persistence. The nature of authority further complicated this adjustment. Orders prioritized speed and responsiveness, often contradicting established doctrine. Initiative was encouraged selectively, constrained by fear of error in an environment where mistakes carried amplified consequences. The warrior learned to act decisively within shrinking margins of autonomy. His training allowed him to operate under pressure, but the framework that once contextualized decision-making eroded. War, as experienced here, functioned less as contest and more as process. Outcomes accumulated through logistics, production, and coordination beyond the battlefield. Individual encounters blended into larger movements invisible from the ground. The warrior sensed this abstraction without fully comprehending it. He felt himself part of something vast yet impersonal, where human effort fed systems that operated at a different scale of time and consequence. Despite these shifts, he did not resist adaptation. He incorporated new practices as required, learning procedures that conflicted with earlier instincts. This created internal tension, resolved pragmatically rather than philosophically. He did what was asked, when asked, trusting that coherence existed somewhere beyond his view. This trust was thinner now, but it remained intact. The contrast between old methods and new realities became most apparent in moments of pause. Between movements, the warrior reflected not on fear but on dissonance. He recognized that the war unfolding around him did not validate the values that had shaped his identity. Yet those values remained his only guide. To abandon them would require a new framework he did not possess. He continued forward, carrying tradition into spaces where it no longer governed outcomes. History accelerated through this mismatch. Decisions cascaded faster than institutions could absorb. Adaptation lagged behind necessity. The warrior experienced this acceleration as compression, where time felt dense and direction uncertain. Events overlapped, consequences unfolded before causes were fully understood. His training emphasized patience and deliberation, qualities increasingly incompatible with the pace imposed by conflict. Still, the warrior's presence mattered in limited ways. He protected others, executed orders, maintained discipline where possible. These actions did not alter the course of war, but they preserved fragments of order within it. His relevance shifted from strategic impact to moral continuity. He embodied a way of acting that resisted total absorption into abstraction. This chapter of conflict did not announce itself as transformation. It presented itself as escalation, as intensification of familiar patterns. Only gradually did it reveal that the patterns themselves had changed. The warrior fought competently, courage intact, discipline unbroken. Yet beneath this continuity lay a growing awareness that the world his training addressed was receding. History moved forward, not waiting for tradition to adjust, carrying him with it into a conflict he recognized only in fragments. Loyalty had once simplified the world. It offered clarity where complexity threatened to overwhelm, binding action to purpose through obedience and trust. As circumstances deteriorated, however, that same loyalty began to exert pressure rather than provide support. Orders arrived carrying expectations that no longer aligned with lived reality. They demanded actions that preserved structure at the expense of safety, coherence at the expense of understanding. The warrior followed them not because they made sense, but because loyalty had taught him that sense was secondary to continuity. Institutional authority weakened unevenly. It did not vanish, nor was it openly challenged. Instead, it thinned. Decisions were delayed, revised, or quietly contradicted by necessity on the ground. Responsibility shifted downward while accountability dissolved upward. The warrior felt this imbalance acutely. He was expected to execute without the assurance that execution served a stable purpose. The chain of command remained intact in form, but its function fragmented under pressure. Conscience entered this space not as rebellion, but as discomfort. The warrior did not question the legitimacy of authority. He questioned its alignment with reality. He noticed how instructions prioritized preservation of image over protection of people, how risk was distributed unevenly, how sacrifice became routine rather than exceptional. These observations did not produce defiance. They produced silence. His training had taught him to absorb strain without outward reaction, and he applied that lesson inward. Safety became conditional. Positions once considered secure now invited exposure. Support promised by doctrine arrived inconsistently or not at all. The warrior adapted through caution rather than protest, altering movement, redistributing effort, compensating where structure failed. Each adaptation preserved immediate survival while deepening awareness of systemic erosion. Loyalty required him to compensate for weaknesses without naming them, a burden that accumulated quietly. Recognition diminished. Acts that once earned acknowledgement became expected, then invisible. The warrior's reliability was assumed, his endurance taken for granted. Praise, when offered, felt procedural rather than reflective. This absence did not provoke resentment. It reinforced a sense of expendability. Loyalty, once reciprocal, now flowed in one direction. The warrior accepted this imbalance because rejection would require redefining his identity beyond service. Clarity suffered as information degraded. Reports conflicted, explanations shifted, rationales dissolved under scrutiny. The warrior navigated this uncertainty by narrowing focus. He concentrated on tasks within reach, people within sight. This psychological contraction preserved function while limiting comprehension. He endured rather than interpreted. Endurance, in this context, became a moral act, preserving order where understanding had failed. The cost of commitment grew less visible but more profound. Fatigue deepened, not from exertion alone but from sustained ambiguity. The warrior carried unresolved tension between what he was ordered to do and what he sensed was necessary. This tension did not manifest as refusal. It manifested as restraint. He withheld judgment, emotion, and expectation. Such restraint prevented collapse of discipline even as it eroded personal certainty. Institutional rituals continued, stripped of earlier confidence. Ceremonies marked continuity even as substance faded. Language remained formal, invoking values increasingly disconnected from outcome. The warrior participated without irony, understanding that ritual preserved cohesion even when meaning thinned. To withdraw from these forms would signal fracture. Loyalty demanded presence even when belief wavered. Historically, such moments produce figures remembered not for decisive action but for persistence. The warrior belonged to this category. He did not seek to alter trajectory. He absorbed its weight. His commitment did not avert decline, but it mitigated its human cost in limited ways. He shielded others where possible, maintained discipline in fragmented units, enforced standards that no longer guaranteed success but preserved dignity. Authority figures struggled visibly. Their decisions reflected constraint rather than conviction. The warrior recognized this not as failure of character but as symptom of systemic exhaustion. He extended loyalty to them as individuals even as institutions faltered. This distinction allowed him to remain committed without illusion. He served people, not abstractions, even when abstractions demanded service. The tragedy of loyalty in such moments lies in its necessity. Without it, collapse accelerates. With it, collapse continues more slowly. The warrior's endurance delayed disintegration without preventing it. His actions maintained functionality long enough for structures to persist beyond their capacity to adapt. History often records such endurance as complicity or inertia, overlooking the absence of viable alternatives. Internally, the warrior adjusted expectations. He ceased anticipating resolution. Duty became present-focused, stripped of narrative. He acted because action was required, not because outcome promised meaning. This shift marked a quiet transformation. Loyalty no longer connected him to future success. It connected him to process. He became a caretaker of decline, sustaining systems long enough for them to exhaust themselves fully. The environment reflected this transition. Positions felt temporary, alliances fragile, objectives provisional. The warrior moved through spaces that no longer suggested permanence. Structures built for stability now functioned as shelters against inevitability. He recognized this without articulating it, responding through caution and patience. This chapter of endurance lacked dramatic rupture. No decisive break forced recognition or choice. Loyalty eroded gradually, transforming from source of strength into weight carried because setting it down would leave nothing to stand on. The warrior remained committed not because commitment promised reward, but because abandonment would sever the last thread of coherence. In such moments, history advances through those who endure rather than those who defy. The warrior's restraint preserved continuity in the face of unraveling. His loyalty did not save the system, but it revealed the cost of its failure. Inevitability asserted itself not through choice, but through persistence until persistence itself became unsustainable. The realization did not arrive as a single moment of clarity. It accumulated slowly, emerging from patterns the warrior could no longer dismiss. He saw it in the composition of units assembled beside his own, younger faces trained under doctrines that barely referenced the traditions he had mastered. Their movements were faster, less ceremonial, oriented toward efficiency rather than form. They carried equipment unfamiliar to him, relied on systems he had not been taught to trust. The battlefield itself seemed reorganized around these changes, as though space now belonged to methods he could not fully inhabit. His skills had not vanished. He remained capable, disciplined, and effective within the limits of what he knew. Yet effectiveness was being redefined. The warrior's strength lay in endurance, close coordination, and an intuitive understanding of terrain shaped by years of repetition. The new strategies prioritized distance, speed, and abstraction. Decisions were increasingly mediated through instruments rather than observation. Violence unfolded beyond the range of personal judgment, and outcomes were calculated before they were witnessed. The warrior found himself operating inside a structure that no longer required his instincts, only his compliance. Identity followed skill. For much of his life, he had understood himself through function. To serve was to exist with purpose. Training had shaped his body, language, and reflexes toward a coherent role within a stable system. As that system adapted beyond recognition, his identity lagged behind. He did not experience this as loss of pride, but as dislocation. He remained who he had always been, yet the world no longer responded to that identity with recognition or need. Sacrifice, too, began to feel provisional. The risks he accepted were real, but their impact seemed diminished. Successes were absorbed into processes that credited technology or strategy rather than individual endurance. Failures were attributed to outdated methods without acknowledging the conditions that forced their use. The warrior did not seek acknowledgement, but he sensed that his sacrifices were no longer integrated into collective meaning. They existed as residue of an older logic, still costly but increasingly peripheral. Younger forces advanced without malice. They did not dismiss the warrior. They simply did not rely on him. Their confidence came from alignment with the present, not from disrespect for the past. The warrior observed them with a mixture of restraint and curiosity. He recognized competence where it existed and understood that their methods addressed realities his own training had not anticipated. This recognition did not soften the distance between them, clarified it. Obsolescence revealed itself as structural rather than personal. The warrior was not failing. The framework that had once made him essential was receding. Entire formations faced the same condition. Men and women shaped by the same traditions found themselves displaced simultaneously, their collective expertise rendered marginal by shifts none of them controlled. History moved through them not because they resisted change, but because change no longer required them. This awareness widened the warrior's perspective. He understood that his experience was not unique, nor tragic in isolation. Generations before him had faced similar transitions, watching the world reorganize around principles that made their sacrifices appear redundant. Empires, armies, and institutions had always depended on such transitions, absorbing one cohort while elevating another. The warrior located himself within this pattern, finding dignity not in relevance but in continuity. Withdrawal presented itself as a possibility, not through instruction but through implication. There were moments when stepping aside would have been practical, even logical. Others had done so, leaving service quietly when it no longer aligned with identity or effectiveness. The warrior understood this option. He did not judge those who took it, yet he could not follow. Withdrawal would have required redefinition beyond service, a reconstruction of self for which he had neither training nor desire. He continued not because victory appeared attainable, but because continuation preserved coherence. His presence maintained a link between past and present, however fragile. Even as his role narrowed, it remained meaningful to him. He served as stabilizer, mentor, and witness. He absorbed risk that others could not yet measure. These contributions were not celebrated, but they mattered within the limited spaces that still depended on human judgment. The environment reflected his position. He occupied transitional spaces, neither central nor obsolete. He operated at the margins of new systems, translating between old expectations and new demands. This mediation was imperfect and often unrecognized, but it reduced friction. The warrior accepted this role without naming it, guided by habit rather than aspiration. Psychologically, he adjusted by releasing expectation of permanence. He no longer imagined a future shaped by his methods. Instead, he oriented himself toward the present, performing tasks with care regardless of their eventual disappearance. This adjustment did not erase loss, but it contained it. He found stability in execution rather than outcome. The human cost of progress manifested quietly. Fatigue deepened, not from physical strain alone but from sustained relevance anxiety. The warrior carried knowledge that his best efforts might not alter trajectory. Yet he also knew that absence would accelerate disintegration. His continued presence slowed transition enough to reduce chaos, even if it could not prevent it. Progress did not humiliate him. It simply moved past. The warrior retained dignity by recognizing this distinction. He did not cling to superiority nor resent displacement. He acknowledged the necessity of change while honoring the labor that had sustained earlier systems. In doing so, he preserved self-respect independent of relevance. As history advanced, the warrior remained embedded within it, not as driver but as bearer. His continuation affirmed that identity need not dissolve when context changes, can persist as form, discipline, and restraint even when function narrows. This endurance did not reverse obsolescence, but it transformed it from personal failure into historical passage. The chapter closes not with resolution, but with acceptance. The warrior's path narrowed, but it did not vanish. He continued forward, shaped by a world that no longer required him fully, yet still depended on his presence in ways it could not articulate. His struggle belonged not to him alone, but to every generation that stands at the edge of transition and chooses to endure rather than disappear. The shift announced itself not through chaos, but through clarity. The event itself had been anticipated in fragments, discussed in cautious language, prepared for without confidence. When it finally arrived, it did not shock the warrior. Instead, it settled into place with a weight that felt permanent. The conditions that surrounded it, orders issued without illusion, formations assembled without ceremony, silence where speeches once stood, signaled that this was not another crisis to be endured and reversed. This was confirmation. The old order would not recover. The warrior took his place as he always had, guided by habit more than belief. His participation was complete, not because he expected restoration, but because withdrawal would have fractured the last coherence he possessed. He moved through familiar motions with an awareness sharpened by finality. Each action carried consequence without promise. The tools he carried still functioned, the commands still aligned, but the meaning beneath them had shifted. They no longer pointed toward renewal, only containment. Around him, the structure of authority revealed its limits. Decisions were executed efficiently, yet without confidence in their long-term value. The warrior observed how leadership now measured success differently, focusing on minimizing loss rather than achieving dominance. The language of ambition had thinned, replaced by calculations of survival. This was not defeat, but transition acknowledged at the highest level. The warrior understood this intuitively, sensing that the event marked not collapse, but closure. The environment bore witness to the change. Landscapes once contested for control were now negotiated for passage. Positions were held not to advance, but to delay. Movement occurred under constraints that accepted loss as inevitable. The warrior adapted without protest, recognizing that his endurance mattered most in these conditions. His experience allowed him to operate without panic, to maintain discipline where uncertainty might otherwise fracture cohesion. The decisive event unfolded without spectacle. There were no moments of singular heroism, no gestures that demanded remembrance. Instead, consequence accumulated quietly. Lines shifted, resources were exhausted, and commitments were reduced. The warrior felt the threshold pass not through emotion, but through recognition. The future he had once imagined was no longer accessible. This did not produce despair, produced recalibration. Understanding replaced hope. The warrior now saw his role with precision. He was no longer contributing to a system that would endure beyond him. He was participating in its final articulation. Every action contributed to preservation rather than expansion. The values he carried, discipline, restraint, loyalty, remained intact, but their application narrowed. They were no longer instruments of progress, but of continuity. Others sensed the same shift, though not all accepted it simultaneously. Some clung to outdated expectations, interpreting restraint as failure. The warrior did not correct them. He understood that recognition of transition cannot be forced. It arrives through experience. His own acceptance did not require explanation. It guided his conduct quietly, allowing him to perform without illusion. The midpoint was structural, not emotional. From this moment, decline would accelerate, but it would do so within a clarified framework. The warrior adjusted his internal metrics accordingly. Victory no longer defined success. Preservation did. The safety of those beside him, the maintenance of order under pressure, and the faithful execution of reduced objectives became his priorities. These were not lesser goals. They were appropriate ones. Psychologically, the shift produced calm rather than agitation. The burden of expectation lifted. The warrior no longer measured himself against outcomes he could not influence. Instead, he focused on conduct. This internal realignment allowed him to endure without bitterness. He was still useful, but usefulness had been redefined. The decisive event also altered how time was perceived. The future shortened, not in duration but in certainty. Plans extended only as far as conditions allowed. The warrior learned to operate within compressed horizons, valuing immediacy over projection. This adjustment was not instinctive, but it was disciplined. He had been trained to respond to reality as it existed, not as it was desired. Legacy entered consideration indirectly. The warrior did not think in terms of remembrance, but he became aware that actions now carried representational weight. Younger forces observed how veterans conducted themselves under irreversible change. The warrior understood that his behavior modeled continuity even as structures dissolved. This awareness reinforced restraint. He avoided excess, knowing that exaggeration would distort memory. The event closed certain paths permanently. Opportunities for reversal vanished without ceremony. The warrior felt this as a narrowing, but not as confinement. He moved forward within the available space, attentive to detail. Small decisions gained importance as their cumulative effect shaped the manner of decline. History, he recognized, would judge this phase not by what was saved, but by how loss was managed. As the chapter settles, the warrior stands fully within the new reality. He does not dramatize it, nor does he resist it. He accepts the threshold crossed and adjusts his posture accordingly. Survival replaces hope, not as surrender, but as strategy. Preservation replaces ambition, not as retreat, but as responsibility. From this point forward, meaning shifts. The warrior's actions will no longer aim to define the future. but to carry forward what remains intact. This is not the end of purpose. It is its transformation. The irreversible shift has occurred, and the warrior, aware and present, continues within it with clarity earned through experience rather than expectation. After the turning point, movement continued much as it had before. Orders were still issued, routes still taken, positions still held. Yet the purpose beneath these actions had shifted decisively. The warrior felt it in the way he prepared himself each day, no longer rehearsing outcomes, only responsibilities. The cause remained intact in name, but belief in its future had dissolved. What endured was obligation, to people beside him, to memories of what had been built, and to a standard of conduct that refused to disappear simply because success was no longer attainable. Persistence now required a different kind of strength. The warrior no longer drew motivation from expectation of victory or restoration. Instead, he acted to prevent unnecessary loss, to shield those without power to choose their exposure. His decisions favored containment over advance, withdrawal over symbolic stand. These choices were not strategic innovations. They were moral calibrations shaped by the recognition that history would proceed regardless of individual will. Within that constraint, dignity became the remaining field of action. The environment reflected this narrowed purpose. Movements were quieter, measured to avoid attention rather than attract it. Engagements occurred reluctantly, resolved quickly when possible. The warrior learned to read absence as carefully as presence, listening for silences that signaled evacuation, noticing abandoned positions that marked priorities abandoned elsewhere. These observations guided him more than formal instruction. Reality now dictated conduct more reliably than doctrine. Psychologically, the warrior experienced neither despair nor hope. Both required belief in change. What replaced them was clarity. He understood precisely what could still be protected and what could not. This clarity sharpened judgment. He avoided waste, whether of effort, resources, or lives. Each decision carried weight not because it might alter the outcome, but because it defined how the outcome would be lived through. The people around him sensed this shift and responded unevenly. Some clung to familiar rhetoric, repeating slogans whose relevance had faded. Others withdrew emotionally, conserving energy by disengaging from purpose entirely. The warrior positioned himself between these extremes. He did not correct language, nor did he abandon it. He allowed words to persist as scaffolding, even when substance thinned. His focus remained on action rather than interpretation. Protection became localized and immediate. The warrior prioritized civilians caught between collapsing structures, comrades whose fatigue compromised judgment, and traditions whose survival depended on being practiced even without recognition. He preserved rituals not for their strategic value, but because they anchored identity. Simple acts, shared meals, maintained routines, enforced discipline, became acts of resistance against disintegration. They asserted that even as systems failed, conduct could endure. Memories gained prominence. The warrior carried recollections of earlier certainty not as longing, but as reference. They reminded him what had once been possible and therefore what deserved preservation in spirit if not in form. These memories guided restraint. He avoided bitterness by understanding that the world which produced him had fulfilled its function. Its passing did not negate its value. This perspective allowed him to act without resentment toward those shaped by newer realities. Moral clarity emerged not through abstraction, but through repetition. Each day reinforced limits. The warrior learned where compromise preserved life and where it eroded meaning. He refused orders that demanded performative sacrifice without protective value, not through defiance, but through interpretation. He framed refusals as adjustments, maintaining alignment while redirecting impact. This approach preserved cohesion while minimizing harm, a delicate balance maintained through credibility earned over time. Silence became a tool. The warrior spoke less, knowing that explanation often invited debate without resolution. His authority rested in consistency rather than persuasion. Others watched how he moved, how he chose positions, how he treated the vulnerable. These observations transmitted values more effectively than instruction. In decline, example carried more weight than command. The emotional weight of this phase accumulated gradually. There were no singular losses that demanded reckoning. Instead, absence spread incrementally. Familiar faces disappeared, routines shortened, objectives reduced. The warrior acknowledged each loss privately, folding it into resolve rather than allowing it to fracture discipline. Grief became internal, expressed through increased care rather than outward display. Importantly, there was no attempt to reverse history. The warrior understood that resistance to inevitability consumed energy without altering direction. His actions faced reality directly, adjusting posture rather than denying momentum. This acceptance did not imply passivity. It allowed precision. By relinquishing impossible goals, he conserved capacity for achievable ones. Honor, in this context, detached from outcome entirely. It resided in method. The warrior judged success by adherence to principle under constraint. This reframing preserved self-respect and offered others a model for endurance. Younger forces observed this and adapted their expectations accordingly. They learned that service did not require illusion to remain meaningful. As the chapter unfolds, persistence becomes the defining theme. The warrior continues not because he believes the cause will prevail, but because withdrawal would negate the coherence of his life. His identity, shaped by service, finds expression even in contraction. He accepts that his role now lies in carrying forward fragments rather than building structures. This phase deepens emotional resonance precisely because it avoids despair. The warrior does not dramatize loss. He integrates it. His resilience is quiet, sustained by discipline rather than hope. Through him, the narrative demonstrates that individuals retain agency even when outcomes are fixed. They choose how to stand within decline, how to treat others, and how to conclude their participation with integrity intact. History advances without pause. Systems dissolve, new orders emerge elsewhere. Within this movement, the warrior's actions appear small, yet they accumulate meaning through consistency. They show that honor can survive transition, that dignity does not depend on success, and that facing inevitability with clarity constitutes its own form of strength. The collapse did not arrive as a single moment, but as a confirmation of what had already been lived through. Institutions that had long claimed permanence ceased to function, not with violence, but with administrative silence. Orders stopped coming. Symbols lost authority overnight. Buildings remained standing while their meaning drained away. What had once coordinated action across distance and time now existed only as memory. The warrior experienced this not as shock, but as recognition. The structure he had been sustaining through discipline and restraint had reached the end of its capacity to endure. Authority dissolved unevenly. Some figures attempted to assert continuity through language alone, issuing statements that carried no mechanism for enforcement. Others withdrew quietly, relinquishing roles without announcement. The warrior observed these shifts without commentary. He understood that authority was not an object to be defended, but a relationship that required belief on both sides. When belief vanished, authority followed. No individual choice could reverse that process. Symbols fell first. Flags were lowered without ceremony. Insignia were removed, not in anger, but in practicality. Uniforms lost their signaling power as allegiances fragmented. The warrior removed his own markers deliberately, folding them away rather than discarding them. This act was not concealment, but closure. He treated the symbols with respect precisely because they no longer functioned. Their value had moved from public utility to personal memory. The collapse widened the frame of experience. The warrior saw how his own endurance mirrored that of thousands shaped by the same systems. Entire generations faced displacement, redundancy, or absorption into new orders that did not recognize their prior service. This was not failure at the level of character. It was transition at the level of structure. The narrative of collapse expanded beyond individual fate, revealing patterns repeated across regions and institutions. Economies stalled, then reoriented. Communication networks fractured, replaced by local improvisation. Legal frameworks lost coherence as enforcement mechanisms vanished. The warrior navigated this landscape through habit rather than instruction. His training, though designed for a different context, provided tools for stability, discipline, assessment, restraint. These skills remained relevant even as their original purpose dissolved. There was no triumph in collapse. No opposing force celebrated visibly. Power redistributed quietly, often temporarily. The absence of spectacle reinforced the impersonal nature of the event. History did not pause to acknowledge its own turning. It simply moved forward, carrying people with it. The warrior understood this intuitively. He did not search for blame or vindication. Collapse, as he experienced it, was exhaustion rather than defeat. Responsibility narrowed further. Without institutional backing, the warrior's actions became entirely personal. He chose where to go, whom to assist, and when to disengage. These choices carried moral weight precisely because they were no longer mediated by authority. He acted conservatively, prioritizing safety and continuity. The collapse had removed justification for risk taken in the name of abstract goals. Communities responded unevenly. Some attempted to recreate old structures through imitation, reproducing forms without substance. Others adapted quickly, abandoning tradition in favor of immediate utility. The warrior observed both approaches with equal caution. He recognized that collapse produced vulnerability not only through loss but through overcorrection. Stability required balance, not nostalgia or rejection. The documentary's thesis clarified through these observations. Ages do not end because individuals fail. They end because systems exhaust the conditions that sustain them. The warrior's loyalty, discipline, and endurance had extended the system's lifespan, but they could not replenish its foundational resources. Collapse was not indictment. It was consequence. The warrior's place within this process remained modest. He was neither hero nor culprit. Events larger than himself determined trajectory. His significance lay in how he moved within inevitability. By refusing excess, by preserving dignity, by assisting others without expectation of recognition, he embodied continuity of conduct even as structures vanished. Memory assumed new importance. Stories circulated among those displaced, recounting not victories, but methods. How discipline was maintained under pressure. How restraint prevented panic. How loyalty functioned even when unrewarded. These memories did not restore institutions, but they influenced how new ones formed. The warrior contributed to this transmission through example rather than narration. Judgment faded from relevance. Without stable frameworks, condemnation and celebration lost coherence. The collapse demanded reflection instead. Observers were guided to consider how complexity accumulates until resolution becomes structural rather than moral. The warrior's experience illustrated this principle. His life intersected with collapse without defining it. As the chapter settles, the old age disappears fully from function, remaining only as reference. The warrior stands within a transformed landscape, shaped by forces beyond intention. His journey reveals that history's endings are rarely dramatic. They are lived through quietly by those who continue to act responsibly even when meaning shifts. The collapse becomes official not through announcement, but through adaptation. New patterns emerge where old ones fail. The warrior participates in this transition without illusion or resistance. His presence affirms the documentary's conclusion that historical change is impersonal, cumulative, and inevitable, and that dignity lies not in preventing it, but in facing it with clarity.